Prelude to Ulysses. The Book of One Dead Man, Part 5. So far, our fearless hero has died, thought about parts of his life, kind of forgot them, went to the graveyard, hung out with his buddy, thought about eating him, instead ate a bunch of food that just appeared. Then he slept with his buddy, his dead body. And then within that slumber, he felt the 7 aspects of his soul leave his body. And that was the Ren, the Sekhem, the Ku, the Ba, the Ka, and the Kibit. Oh yeah, and the Seku. I really liked that part. I don't remember everything about it though. But that's kind of the norm here on planet Earth in this house. Okay, let's do it. 5. A hook went into my nose, battered through the gate at the roof of the nostril, and plunged into my brain. Pieces, gobbets, and whole parts of dead flesh of my mind were now brought out through one aperture of my nose, then the other. Yet for all it hurt, I could have been made of small rocks and roots. I ached no more than the earth when a weed is pulled, and comes up with its hairs tearing away from the clods of soil. Pain is present, but as the small cry of the small cry of the uprooted plant. So did the hooks, narrow in their curve, go up the nose, enter the brain, and poke like blind fingers in a burrow to catch stuffs of the brain and pull them away. Now I felt like a rock wall at the base of which rakes are ripping, and I was warm curiously as though the sunlight were baking. But it was only the breath of the first embalmer, hot with wine and figs. How clear was the sense of smell! Still, an enigma remained. How could my mind continue to think when they pulled my brain apart? They were certainly scooping chunks of material as lively as dry sponge through the dry tunnels of my nose, and I realized, for there was a flash in my cranium when the hook first entered, that one of my lights in the land of the dead had certainly stirred. Was it the Ba, the Kabit, or the Ka that was now helping me to think? And as I gagged as a particularly caustic drug, some wretched mixture of lime and ash, was poured in by the embalmers to dissolve whatever might be stuck to the inside of my skull. How long they worked I do not know. How long they allowed that liquid to dwell in the vault of my emptied head is but one more question. From time to time they lifted my feet, held me upside down, then set me back. Once they even turned me on my stomach to slosh the fluids and let the caustic heat out my eyes. 2 flowers could have been plucked when those eyes were gone. At night, my body would go cold. By midday, I was close to warm. Of course, I could not see, but I could smell, and I got to know the embalmers. One wore perfume, yet his body always carried the unmistakable pungency of a cat in heat. The other was a heavy fellow with a heavy odor, not altogether bad. He was the one with breath of wine and figs. He smelled as well fields and mud, and rich food was usually in him, a meat eater. His sweat was strong, yet not unpleasant. Something loyal came out of the gravies of his flesh. Because I could smell them as they approached, I knew it was daylight. So soon as the embalmers arrived, and I could count the hours. I knew it was daylight so soon as the embalmers arrived, and I could count the hours. Their scent altered with the heat of the air in this place. From midday to 3, every redolence, good and bad, of the hot banks of the Nile was also near. After a time, I came to realize I must be in a tent. There was often the crack of sailcloth flapping overhead, and Gus would clap at my hair, a sensation as definite in impression as a hoof stepping on grass. My hearing had begun to return, but by a curious route, for I had no interest in what was said. I was aware of the voices of others, but felt no desire to comprehend the words. They were not even like the cry of animals, so much as the lulling of surf, the skittering of wind. Yet my mind felt capable of surpassing clarity. Once I think Haffertiti came to visit, or since it is likely the tent was on family grounds, it's possible she strolled through the gardens and stopped to look in. I certainly caught her scent. It was Haffertiti, certain enough. She gave one sob, as if belief in the mortal end of her son had finally come, and left immediately. Somewhere in those first few days, they made an incision in the side of my belly with a sharp flint knife. I know how sharp, for even the few senses of my remains could still employ. A sense of sharpness went through me like a plough breaking ground, but sharper, as if I were a snake cut in two by a chariot wheel. And then began the most detailed searching. It is hard to describe, for it did not hurt, but I was ready in those hours to think of the inside of my torso as common to a forest and a grove. And one by one the trees were removed, their roots disturbing veins of rock, their leaves murmuring. I had dreams of cities, drifting down the Nile like floating islands. Yet when the work was done, I felt larger, as if my senses now lived in a larger space. Was it that my heart and my lungs had been placed in one jar, and my stomach and small intestines in another? Leave it that my organs were spread out in different places, floating in different fluids and spices, yet still existing about me, a village. Eventually their allegiances would be lost, wrapped and placed in the canopic jars. What they knew of my life would then be offered to their own God. How I brooded over what these gods would know of me once my organs were in their jars. Quebhsneuf would dwell in my liver, and would know of all the days when my liver's juices had been brave, as well as would Kebhensnof, Kebhsnof, know of the hours when the liver, like me, lived in the fog of a long fear. A simple example, the liver, but more agreeable to contemplate my lungs. For with all they knew of my passions, would they still be loyal, once they moved into the jar of the jackal Tuamutef, and lived in the domain of that scavenger? I need to say that again, as if it was a question. For with all they knew of my possessions, would they still be loyal once they moved into the jar of the jackal Tuamutef, and live in the domain of that scavenger? I did not know, so long at least as my organs remained unwrapped, and therefore in a manner still belonged to me. I could understand how once embalmed, and in their jar I could understand how once embalmed and in their jar I would lose them. No matter how scattered my parts might be all over the tables of this tent, there still remained a sense of family among us. The vessel of my empty corpse comfortably surrounded by old fleshy islands of endeavor, these lungs, liver, stomach, and big and little guts all attached to the same memories of my life. If with their own separate and fiercely prejudiced view, how differently, after all, had my life seemed to my liver and to my heart. So, not at all, therefore, was this embalming tent as I had expected? No. No bloody abattoir, like a butcher's stall, more like a herb kitchen. Certainly the odors encouraged the same long flights of fancy you could find in a spice shop. Merely figure the vertigos of my nose when the empty cavity of my body, so much emptier than the belly of a woman who has just given birth, was now washed, soothed, and stimulated, cleansed, peppered, and herbified, and left with a resonance through which no hint of the body's corruption could breathe. They scoured the bloody inside with the palm wine, and left the memories of my flesh in ferment. They pounded in spices and peppers, and rare sage from the limestone foundations to the west. Then came leaves of thyme and the honey of bees who had fed on thyme. The oil of orange was rubbed into the cavity of the ribs, and the oil of lemon balmed the inside of my lower back to free it of the stubborn redolence of the viscera. Cedar chips, essence of jasmine, and branchlets of myrrh were crushed. I could hear the cries of the plants being broken more clearly than the sound of human voices. The myrrh even made its clarion call, a powerful aromatic, as powerful as in the kingdom of herbs as the Pharaoh's voice, was the myrrh laid into the open shell of my body. Next came cinnamon leaves, stem, and cinnamon bark to sweeten the mirth, like rare powders added to the sweetmeats and the stuffing of a pigeon. Were these bewildering atmospheres they laid into me. Dizzy was I with their beauty. When done, they sewed up the long cut inside of my body, and I seemed to rise through high veils of fever, while something of memory, intoxicated by these tendrils of the earth, began to dance, and the oldest of my friends was young, while the children of my mistresses grew old. I was like a royal barge lifted into the air under the ministrations of a rare vizier. Cleaned, stuffed, and trussed, I was deposited into a bath of natron, that salt that dries the meat to stone, and there I lay with weights to keep me down. Slowly, over the endless days that followed, as the waters of my own body were given up to the thirst of the salt, which drank at my flesh like caravans arriving at an oasis, so all moisture, but its insatiable desire to liquefy my meats, had to leave my limbs. Bathed in natron, I became hard as the wood of a hull, then hard as the rock of the earth, and I felt the last of me depart to join my ka, my ba, and my fearsome kibit. And the shell of my body entered the stone of 10,000 years. If there was nothing I could smell any longer, no more than a stone that can be a present of a scent, still the hardened flesh of my body became like one of those spiraled chambers of the sea that are thrown up on the beach, yet contain the roars of water when you hold them to your ear. I became not unlike that roar of water, for I was close to hearing old voices that passed across the sands. If now I could not smell, I could certainly hear. And like the dolphin whose ears are reputed able to pick up the echoes from the other end of the sea, so I sank into the bath of natron. And my body passed farther and farther away, like a stone washed by fog, baked by sun, and given the flavor of the water on the bank. I was entering that universe of the dumb, where it was part of our gift to hear the story told by every wind to every stone. Yeah, even as I was carried on these voyages with many, his lacquered case wet with my breath, so close did I hold him, I must have stirred in my sleep, or gone through a space in the travels of dreams. For 2 clouds appeared to meet. Could it have been the touch of these clouds that rocked my sleep? I felt my body descend, breath by breath, into the case of the mummy. Yes, sink into it, as if the hard case were only a soft and receiving earth. Yes, was melded into the case of the mummy, and my memory was one with many again, Emmy and I. Once more, I felt the ministrations of the embalmers, and lived through the hours when they washed the natron from my hardened body, with the liquor of a vase that held no less than 10 perfumes. O sweet-smelling soul of the great God, they intoned, you contain such a sweet odor that your face will never change or perish. Words I did not hear, but their cadence had been heard before. I understood what was said, and never had to sniff the unguent with which they rubbed my skin and smeared my feet, laid my back in holy oil, and gilded my nails and my toes. They laid special bandages upon my head, put the bandage of Nekob on my brow, and Hathor for my face. Thoth was the bandage over my ears, and folded pieces within the mouth, and a cloth over the chin and back of the neck. 22 pieces to the right of my face were laid in, and 22 to the left. They offered up prayers that I might be able to see and hear in the land of the dead, and they rubbed my calves and thighs with black stone oil and holy oil. My toes were wrapped in linen, whose every piece had a drawing of the jackal, and my hands were bandaged in another linen on which the images of Isis and Hep and Ra and Amset. Ebony gum water was washed over me. They laid in amulets as they wrapped, figures of turquoise and gold, of silver and lapis lazuli, crystal and carnelian, and a ring was slipped over one gold-painted finger, its seal filled with a drop of each of the 36 substances of the embalmer. Then they laid on flowers of the ankam plant and widths and windings of linen, narrow strips longer than the length of a royal barge, and folded linens to fill my cavities. In company with many, I breathed the embalming resin that would seal the cloth to my pores of stone. I heard the sound of prayers and the soft breath of the artists as they painted my burial case and sang to one another in the hot tent beneath the moving sun. And on a day I came to know, at last, the sounds of paving stones thundering beneath a sledge, while I was dragged with all the weight of my case to the tomb where I would be put away in my enclosing coffins. And I could hear the quiet sobbing of the women, delicate as the far-off cry of gulls in the invocation of the priest. The god Horus advances with his ka. The coffin case bumped on the steps of the tomb. Then hours passed. Was it hours? In a ceremony I could neither hear nor smell, but for the grating of vessels of food and this knocking of small instruments and the sound of the liquors being poured upon the floor. But that resounded through the stone of me like an underground river in a cavernous fall. And then the blow of a rock fell on my head, and was followed by the grinding of chains. But it was only the scratch of an instrument upon my face. Then I felt a great force opening my stone jaws, and many words flowed into my mouth. I heard a roaring of the waters of my conception, and sobs of heartbreak. My own? I did not know. Rivers of air came to me like a new life, and the forgotten instant of death also came, and was gone as quickly. Then was my ka born, which is to say I was born again. And was it a day, a year, or not for the passing of 10 kings? But I was up in myself again, apart from many and his poor body in the coffin. Yes, I was separate. I was aware of myself, but I was ready to weep. For now, I knew why Many was my dearest friend, and his death an agony to me. Yes, my dim memory of his life is now nothing but the dim memory of my own life. For now, I knew who I was, and I was no better than a ghost in a panic for food. I was nothing but the poor ka of Menenhedet II. And if the first gift of the dead was that they could add the name of the Lord to their own name, then I was the ka of poor, helpless Osiris Menenhedet II. Yes, the ka, the most improperly buried and fearful ka who must live in this violated tomb. Oh, where was I now that I knew where I was? And the thought of the land of the dead opened to me with all the recognition that I was but a seventh part of what had once been the lights, faculties, and powers of a living soul. Once my living soul. Now I was no more than the double of the dead man, and what was left of him was no more than the corpse of his badly wrapped body and me. Whoa! Whoo! What a trip! Oh man, I thought. Oh, so was it the ka in the other chapter narrating? Wow, that was very neat. Oh, neat reveal that Many is him. So, God, I feel like I need to read Gotta read that chapter before this again. Or maybe that could have just been what happens to him. That just might be the story of what happens to the Ka. But no, because he was sleeping next to many. He was for sure segregated from many. So he was in a pyramid. That's where the double originates as. The Ka is like the dark double. It's like the doppelgangers, the Tulpa, formed as you. I watched too much of Twin Peaks. I love this book so far. Just really well written. Okay, tune in some other time for when I forgot I read this and start reading it again.